Hi, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited for this webinar that we have today. My name is Kayla Ripple, and I'm a principal associate with the Lenfest Ocean Program. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with what we do, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects to address the needs that face decision makers and stakeholders. You can learn more about us and the different projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter to receive updates on projects like this one and others that are starting to end this year. If you're on Twitter, be sure to follow us at lenfestocean. In fact, we'll be live tweeting this webinar today using the hashtag LOPwebinar, so feel free to join us there and use that hashtag as well. This webinar is the first one the first installment of a monthly webinar series that will be highlighting projects from our Climate-Resilient Fisheries Grant Portfolio. Through this portfolio, we aim to support projects where scientists are working with managers and stakeholders to better understand how climate change will impact fisheries, fisheries management, and communities. So this can include topics such as predicting range shifts of economically important fish stocks, understanding the climate vulnerability of communities, and providing guidance on adaptive management for fisheries. The portfolio has a US focus, although there are a few international studies, for example, the project you'll hear about today. So if you're interested in learning more about these projects, my colleague Emily Knight will be dropping a link to these in the chat box. It's here that you can view the projects, but also sign up for upcoming webinars in this monthly series. Most of these projects are coming to an end, but today we're kicking off the webinar series with a new project in the portfolio. So we're very excited to have joining us Kathy Mills with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, Claire Enterline also with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and Kristen Kleisner with the Environmental Defense Fund. They'll tell us about their somewhat new project titled Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems by 2030, or FishSCORE 2030. So before we get started, just a few logistical things. To prevent any feedback or echoes, all attendees are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to drop those in the chat box or the Q&A box during the webinar. If you have comments or other resources you think would be useful to share with others during the webinar, please put those in the chat box. And then if you have a question, you can submit that through the question box. I'll be keeping track of those through the webinar. And at the end, I'll read the questions out loud for the research team to answer. If we don't get to your question, or if you have any follow-up questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to members of the research team or us at Lenfest. We'd definitely love to hear from you. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded. We'll distribute the links broadly afterwards, but please feel free to share this with others at the end and follow up with us if you have any other questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy to get us started. Let me stop sharing my screen. And Claire, you should be, there you go.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. As Kayla said, I am going to be introducing a new project in the Lenfest portfolio that focuses on advancing climate-resilient marine fisheries during the UN Ocean Decade. Just want to acknowledge that there are a number of collaborators on this project in addition to Claire and Kristen, who you'll hear from later, and they're all listed here on the first screen. Next slide, Claire. Okay, just to start with a little bit of background, our work is really focused on climate resilient fisheries, and understanding fisheries in the context of climate change is increasingly important. We are seeing climate change affect the oceans in a variety of ways. Temperatures around the world, both over oceans and land, are increasing, and the oceans have actually been absorbing a tremendous portion of the excess heat content in the atmosphere. So essentially, they are buffering some of the effects of climate change and warming that we are experiencing here on land. In addition to warming across the world's oceans, we're also seeing rising sea levels. That obviously has impacts particularly at the coastal edge in terms of coastal habitats and infrastructure that supports fisheries. We're seeing declines in Arctic sea ice and in Arctic regions. Obviously, this can have impacts to communities and fisheries in a variety of ways, particularly affecting traditional and indigenous fisheries that may access the water and resources they harvest via sea ice. And it's also affecting transportation and shipping patterns that can interact with fisheries in that region as well. And then another consequence of climate change in many regions is increasing storminess, which has implications for safety at sea for people on the water participating in harvest-related activities. Next slide, Claire. So as we think about climate change, we're seeing effects of climate change permeate through sort of the physical conditions of the oceans to marine ecosystems, affecting habitats, habitat conditions and species in our oceans, and then also to social systems that are connected to those ecosystems. And particularly in our case, our focus is on how that connection occurs through fisheries. So climate change is affecting fisheries in terms of harvest capacity, the productivity and location of resources that fishers harvest, and their harvest practices and handling practices. It's also affecting seafood throughout the supply chain. This is an example from Fiji and a local market in Fiji. And then affecting many coastal communities with important components of their economy connected to fisheries. So we can think about fisheries as having, multiple different dimensions and seeing effects of climate change coming through in a variety of different ways. Next slide. So the background for the work that has led to the FishSCORE Ocean Decade program really arose through a SNAP working group on climate-resilient fisheries that Kristen and I co-led along with Pat Sullivan. And through this working group, we were taking a look at fisheries from a multidimensional perspective, thinking about climate resilience of fisheries in terms of ecological, socioeconomic, and governance dimensions. And some of the work that came out of this working group included a review of climate resilient attributes in social ecological systems and thinking about how those might apply to marine fisheries, an evaluation of what resilience looks like in case studies of fisheries from around the world, and then an integration of this information into a climate resilience assessment toolkit. So the foundation for the FishSCORE Ocean Decade program really stems from the synthesis of resilience attributes that we developed through this working group that spanned ecological, socioeconomic, and governance dimensions of fisheries, as well as domains related to organization, learning, agency, assets, and flexibility that operate across all three of those dimensions. Next slide, please. So we can take those resilience attributes and think about how they come into play in different fisheries around the world. So through this working group, we were able to look at 18 cases of marine fisheries from very small scale fisheries to some of the largest industrial fisheries in the world, and to think about features of those fisheries that support climate resilience and that are important to resilience in those fishery systems. And what we saw is that there are important attributes of resilience that come through across ecological, governance, and socioeconomic dimensions of fisheries. So in terms of ecological features, for example, harvesting species that have sort of broad environmental tolerance and broad environmental niches can confer resilience in those systems because those species tend to be more resilient to change. Governance systems that are responsive to change, that operate efficiently, and that are equitable and inclusive can support resilience. And then also within the socioeconomic dimension, having access to a diversity of economic opportunities and having flexible infrastructure and mobility to move around as needed can also be important for resilience. So these were just some of the highlighted attributes that emerged from this case study work and case study analysis. But essentially what it demonstrated is that we could use this set of attributes to think about that as a basis for a resilience assessment framework for marine fisheries. Next slide, Claire. So we integrated this information as a component of a larger, sort of broader climate resilient fisheries planning tool. And within this planning tool, which is available online at climateresilientfisheries.net, we lay out a 6-step process that can support resilience assessment and planning in marine fisheries. It involves defining what the fishery system is, that's the focus of the assessment and planning effort, identifying climate impacts within the system and evaluating resilience attributes, and then moving into a planning or action phase. What are some potential actions and which ones are priorities for implementing to support resilience in that fishery? So I hope that many of you might be interested in taking a look at this site, but it is really from this sort of foundation that we will be sort of moving some of these elements, we hope, into broader use and improvement and advancement as part of the FishSCORE Ocean Decade program. And Claire is going to give you details about that program in just a minute, but I'm going to first give you a little bit of broader background about the Ocean Decade program in general. So the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development has been established with a goal of developing the science we need for the ocean we want. And the mission of the Ocean Decade is to develop transformative ocean science solutions that can support sustainable development and support the connections between people and the ocean. The Ocean Decade has established a set of target outcomes for the decade, which would be to advance towards an ocean that is clean, that's healthy and resilient, that is productive, that can be predicted, that is safe, that is accessible, and that is inspiring and engaging to society. So that lays out some of the big picture, high-level goals for the Ocean Decade. Next slide. And the Ocean Decade is structured so that there are a number of decade actions that contribute to overall objectives for the decade and that will address the major challenges that the Ocean Decade seeks to address, all of which are tied to advancing towards achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. And so one of the actions, a number of actions, programs, projects, and other contributions have been endorsed through the Ocean Decade program. And one of the actions that has been endorsed is a program that we put forward called FishSCORE, Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems by 2030. And Claire is going to introduce you to more details of this program.
Thanks very much, Kat. So the FishSCORE program, Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems, was built off of a lot of the concepts that Kathy was talking about, but has a broader goal, and that is to sustain fisheries as a source of food and jobs while protecting ocean ecosystems in the face of a changing climate. And the structure of this is through the development of an international network, through building and supporting local and regional collaborations to co-develop climate resilient strategies in diverse types of fisheries. And then to connect that global ocean science that we have with that international network to those societal benefits at local and regional scales, and to elevate those local insights to the global scale. And the FishSCORE approach to achieve that goal is multidisciplinary, voluntary, and collaborative, and all built on the core principles of inclusivity and diversity, equity, co-leadership and knowledge transfer, and building this network that has many different kinds of participants, from scientists and knowledge holders of many different kinds, fishery participants, managers and practitioners, and policy experts, to provide opportunities for those folks to get together, be able to exchange ideas and experiences, and iteratively through the program, because it will go through 2030, to continually go through and reflect and strategize on what is working with the program, what is being able to be advanced, and how can the program achieve our goals better. And through these goals, we hope to have direct outputs, including some systems-oriented understanding and approaches, information and tools like the Climate-Resilient Fisheries Planning tool that Kathy was talking about, as well as others, as well as synthetic outputs like best management practices and high-level science and policy recommendations, all for that key outcome of climate-resilient fisheries that promote sustainability, equity, and agency of all people involved. And just going back to that real quick, Kathy and many of our other partners and have put out a paper at the beginning of the FishSCORE program that describes these goals and the framework of the program in more detail. So FishSCORE as a program, how do we hope to achieve these goals? We hope to achieve these goals through many different aspects, some of which, really all of which will build upon each other. So one is to build a global network to facilitate information. And we will do that through multiple different things, including our own webinar series that we're jointly hosting with some of the other UN programs, through facilitating workshops and discussion groups, and ways to let people share their experiences amongst each other. And that will also hopefully develop new collaborations for moving more on the groundwork forward. To co-develop tools and information for assessing climate impacts and potential strategies, including revisions to the Climate Resilient Fisheries Planning tool. And I know Kristen will talk a little bit more about that as it relates to our work with Lenfest. We hope to strengthen and support capacities for employing climate resilient strategies in many different types of fishery systems. And this will be through projects that we both directly support, and then also that come to us through the UN Ocean Decade process for alignment with FishSCORE that we can support in a more general fashion. To synthesize the efforts and the local and regional information to evaluate the scalability and transferability of experiences that support resilience and innovation. And then finally, to use all of that information that's gained through the network, through those experiences, through those discussion groups, and through those on-the-ground work to recommend and support the implementation of policies, processes, and solutions at multiple scales, from local to global. The UN Ocean Decade has many different programs. And so within the framework of the Ocean Decade, there are different kinds of actions. Programs, you can kind of think of them as umbrella actions for which we have more general goals, that our goals span the entire decade and that are global in scope. And some of the related UN Ocean Decade programs that we're working closely with right now are the Supreme Program, SmartNet, and Blue Foods Futures, which we're co-hosting a monthly webinar series with, as well as engaging with the Early Career Ocean Professionals program. We currently have 4 projects associated with this. Projects are usually shorter in duration and a little bit local or regional in scale. And those 4 projects are one from Copy Solidar, RL, to increase collective action for implementation of voluntary guidelines for sustainability of small-scale fishing in Costa Rica and Honduras. One with the Spanish Institute of Oceanography that will use climate-smart strategies to develop resilience in artisanal fisheries in Mediterranean marine protected areas. One by the Kenya Marine Fisheries Research Institute, looking at the Western Indian Ocean upwelling zones and how productivity will change under climate change, and the effects that that will then have on large pelagic fisheries and the communities that depend on them. And one by Daluhe in the Philippines, looking at bioregional resilience, professional coastal resource management planning. Each of those 4 projects came to us through the UN. They are working on their own to complete their goals, and we're happy to help them develop relationships with each other and with others through our role as a UN program. We do have a current call for actions that closes today through the UN Ocean Decade, and we expect to be adding more projects in the coming months. Different ways that anyone can become involved with the FishSCORE network. The FishSCORE network is not something that is by invitation only, or that you need to submit and be reviewed. You can simply sign up. So on the our website, which is gmri.org /FishSCORE 2030, you can sign up to be part of the network. And through that, we hope to be able to send out newsletters to you, provide opportunities to engage in workshops and webinars. Through the projects that I just talked about, as well as facilitating projects through the leads of the FishSCORE program. We will be developing working groups as time goes on, focused on specific topics that are related to climate resilience, with the goal of those working groups having some outputs at the end of them. Folks can engage through leadership to shape the direction, strategies, partnerships, and funding, and other ways that the FishSCORE is moving forward. And if you're interested in that, please do reach out to one of us directly. And then also to develop a management policy pipeline. So avenues for the uptake and use of the information and understanding, and the policy recommendations that will be coming out of the program. So thanks for letting me introduce the program. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to talk more about our work with Lenfest.
Great. Thanks, Claire. And hi, everyone. Thanks, Kayla and the Lenfest team for organizing this webinar for us. So what I'm going to walk you through is the funded work that we have under FishSCORE right now. And we're very grateful to have secured funding from the Lenfest Ocean Program to help support the efforts of FishSCORE, specifically to advance climate resilient fisheries during the UN Ocean Decades, which is a critical issue. Some of what I'll say, Claire touched on bits of it, but I'll go into a little more detail. But our key objective that this funding is specifically helping to support is the synthesis of key knowledge gaps around major climate stressors, and then the impacts on the environment and people that these stressors are causing. So really trying to understand what sorts of strategies are being applied or considered to advance climate resilience, and whether there are commonalities or key differences that we can identify that can help provide some lessons and best practice guidance. It's a very diverse topic. We just kind of scratched the surface of all the work we did on resilience, but it is quite a broad topic, and so we're looking for ways to broaden the knowledge that we gained by working on the SNAP, starting with the SNAP working group, and throughout this network. And then, so as part of that, we're going to undertake some climate resilience assessments using available tools, and that will include the SNAP tool that Kathy described, the Climate Resilient Fisheries Planning Tool. And we're going to use these assessments to try to understand and compare different resilience approaches that are being used around the world, and different pathways for improving resilience in the system. And that's, again, at ecological, within the socio-ecological system. So, governance, framework, management, within communities, et cetera. And try to understand what are the influential factors that are needed. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for the first objective, our key question is really, how are marine fisheries experiencing and responding to impacts of climate change? And what are the contextual factors that are associated with different types of responses? And I think that the impetus for this is really to understand the diversity of impacts, and how responses vary according to the nature of the climate impact, the scale of the fishery in which the impact is unfolding, and other contextual factors. Um, Things that are also important are the inherent resilience of the system and the social and the ecological networks that exist within that fishery system. So to address this question, we're undertaking a systematic review of the case studies that we carried out under the SNAP Climate Resilient Fisheries project that Kathy mentioned, and building out from there to increase, sort of the sample pool that we have. We will, be using an online questionnaire, which will be asking the FishSCORE network to fill out. And we'll also be at the World Fisheries Congress in early March. I'll talk more about this at the end, but we'll be hosting a workshop to try to examine, what are the different resilience pathways. We're also anticipating that we'll likely have a report and a peer-reviewed publication from the workshop. Next slide, thanks. Sorry. For objective 2, which is around advancing this assessment and planning for resilience, we're asking the question how resources can be improved to advance climate resilient assessment and planning in local to regional scale marine fisheries. And our plan is, again, to build from the Climate Resilient Fisheries planning tool by applying it in specific fisheries and trying to identify ways that the tool can be improved via some targeted feedback. Where we got with the SNAP project, which actually went a little bit longer than I think Kathy and Pat and I anticipated due to, COVID and continuing that project virtually. It went for a couple of years. We got quite a long way and we developed this tool, but it wasn't beta tested, and so that's something that we really want to do. We want to test it, excuse me, with different practitioners, in different settings, improve access to the tool, and that could be, through development of a facilitator's guide, additional training resources, and those could be in different languages. So again, really trying to improve the tool's utility and application in facilitated group settings and for individual practitioners to use. Next slide. And so finally, for sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. For objective 3, we're trying to synthesize insights from a comparison of approaches to build resilience. And we're asking, how do the types of stressors, the contextual factors, and the resilience attributes that we've identified of any particular fishery influence the strategies and the approaches that might be taken for building climate resilience in the fishery system? And so I think this step is really a lot to do with outreach to different projects, or at least part of it is to do with outreach to different projects that are developing or have undertaken climate resilience planning efforts in different fisheries at different scales. And we're really we want to synergize and assess the characteristics of the system and examine the strategies in terms of what's worked and what hasn't. So next slide, please. Great. Okay, so we think we've all mentioned this. There are a number of ways to get involved, and we'd really welcome new participants within the FishSCORE network. On the next slide, our emails we'll put our emails up so that you can reach out to any of the 3 of us if you're interested. And I've noticed in the chat, Kayla's been doing an amazing job of putting in links to pretty much everything we've talked about, so that's great. And as we move along in the FishSCORE process, we're going to be establishing working groups and various discussion forums, which is in some ways will parallel efforts in some of the other programs that the UN Ocean Decade programs that Kathy mentioned, like Supreme SmartNet, Blue Foods Futures, and others. One discussion forum that we have established and that was mentioned earlier is the seminar series. It's titled Fisheries and Aquaculture in the Ocean Decade. And this webinar series is meant to highlight the impact of climate change on fisheries and aquaculture and the communities that depend on them. This, again, is jointly hosted by the other UN Ocean Decade programs that Claire had listed. So that's Blue Food Futures, the Fisheries Strategies are FishSCORE, and then the Sustainability, Predictability, and Resilience of Marine Ecosystems, SUPREME. And the webinar series is highlighting current efforts and challenges along the spectrum of the climate fisheries nexus. So we're looking for presentations and just for discussions that range from more data-driven efforts being undertaken around the world to better understand oceanographic and biological changes affecting fisheries, to things about how the results can be used to inform fisheries management of both fisheries and aquaculture management, and to help improve and make sustainable food decisions. And it'll include, topics about the ways that people and communities are being impacted and trying to adapt to the way these changes are unfolding. And then the third way is if you have a project that is focused on aspects of building resilience in fisheries, and that could be a project that's more focused more on ecological or more on social aspects of the system, or that deals with communities, or is more at the regional, national, or internationally focused. This is a very, as I said at the start, a broad topic, and we're looking to be inclusive to different voices and situations in the resilient space. So we'd welcome the chance to learn more and potentially to have your project linked more formally through the UN Decade of Ocean Science process. So if you're interested in that, of course, please, you're welcome to reach out for more information. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight in green, these boxes here, a couple of timeline steps here and opportunities for further engagement. So one is this workshop that we're going to be hosting at the World Fisheries Congress. It's the Sunday, March 3rd, right ahead of the Fisheries Congress kicking off. And it'll be broadly exploring resilience pathways and resources for local and regional assessments. After the World Fisheries Congress in late spring, we're going to be deploying a questionnaire about different climate issues. So really doing the work to try to understand the sorts of impacts and challenges that people are facing. And then third, feedback on climate resilient fisheries planning tools. So that I talked a little bit about, but really we are looking for practitioners who are interested in applying the tool in their fishery and providing us feedback with how it worked, what didn't work, and all in an effort to improve the tool and iterate on it. And then finally, there's this later in the year and into next year, our efforts to synthesize the information that we get, that we're able to collect through the network and through these various efforts and case studies, and then to put forward some outputs based on that to the community. So I think with that, next slide is just our emails, and to say thank you to everyone for attending today, and we're definitely happy to have conversation and answer any questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our speakers. This was really great to have like an overview of the program and then also some of the objectives and see how you're going to try to synthesize all this information from across the world essentially to understand climate impacts on fisheries. So we do have a couple questions in the chat, and I would say to others who are still on, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'm looking in the Q&A box, so if you have them in like the actual chat box, I might miss it. So please put it in that Q&A box. It'll be a lot easier for me to see. But I do have a question here. thank you for the great presentation. They start off. Can someone speak a little to the fishery scale that's appropriate for assessment? Could the frame be as broad as Northwest Atlantic sharks or high seas tuna down to very specific fisheries like Maryland blue crab or Maine eels, to give some examples?
I'm happy to try to answer that unless Kathy or Claire want to jump in.
Go
But
for it. That's
okay, yeah, I mean, and feel free to chime in. Yeah, it's definitely inclusive of, you know, multiple scales. And even within the case studies that we looked at, in the SNAP working group, we had a variety of different, scales and types of fisheries that we were looking at, everything from, you know, very, very small scale, more even, verging on subsistence fishing to more industrial, scale fisheries. We had multi-species fisheries, and, you know, we addressed some of the challenges there with dealing with very complex, multi-species fisheries and how you assess resilience, in those systems versus something that's a very, targeted, directed fishery. Kathy, Claire?
Yeah, I would say that I think we've also thought about applications within communities. And so thinking about a fishery that exists within a community context, and that may not represent the full scale of that whole fishery, but thinking about it at that scale as well, particularly here with some of our work in the Northeast, as well as with a new project that I have with a collaborator in Fiji. It will be sort of taking a perspective of fisheries within a community context. So combining the sort of species of interest, the way the fishery operates with that community setting. So we hope this is a fairly flexible approach, and certainly through the work that we will continue doing and the work that we are trying to help support from other projects, I think we'll learn a lot more about what works and how we can sort of improve resources for application at multiple scales.
Great. I had a question to put some of the slides back up, and I think that's mostly because people wanted to see the contact information. Claire, I saw that you had put everyone's email in there as well. I have a little slide that I can put up too that includes everyone's contact information so that people can have access to that. Just a reminder, please do feel free to reach out to the research team here and us at Lenfest too if you have any follow-up questions after the webinar or interested in joining this network. So we do have another question that's more broad about some of the resources or information we have included. I included links to the papers that you all were talking about in your presentation, and we'll also include those in the follow-up email with the webinar recording too. But this question is asking, for those sourcing seafood from around the world and preparing for likely disclosure requirements regarding climate risk, what sources of information would you recommend they read to understand potential impacts on specific species given the 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degree climate scenarios?
That is a great question. And I hope that others might contribute to this response. I think a lot of the detailed studies under specific climate scenarios for particular species, especially with an interest in productivity, are species-specific studies. And so, you know, those would be more in the science, in this peer-reviewed literature, but for species distribution shifts, which are really important in terms of how fisheries are being affected by some of the changes that are occurring, there are more studies that are across many different species and you know, at regional to global scales as well. And so I think that, you know, there are a number of portals that show shifts in species distribution from observations, but for looking at projected futures, Jackie Vogel just gave a talk on our last webinar and mentioned the Ocean Futures website or web portal, and maybe Kristen's nodding. She looks like she knows a lot more about this than I do, so maybe she can elaborate on that.
Yeah, the Ocean Futures platform is one that's looking more at ocean conflict areas, potential for conflict, but the underlying one of the underlying data layers that Jackie was really quite involved with has to do with species distribution shifts and how those intersect with other factors. So I think that is one, but there's, I think, DISMAP, there's a whole bunch, yeah, I think Jay just put that in there. There's a whole bunch that in the US and other places. And I would just say, and there are some, there's global species mapping. They tend to be like longer time horizons, but there's a lot of work that we're doing too on climate vulnerability assessments, and stemming from what the US and what NOAA did with vulnerability assessments for data limited places in the world. So how you bring information that might not be as resolved as a fine scale, spatially resolved model of fish distribution shift, but you can use other information to try to understand how vulnerable something is going to be to climate. And there are other tools like productivity, susceptibility, PSA, that analysis that helps to tell you about how a particular stock might fare in terms of its productivity and its fishing pressure, what the type of fishing pressure. And I think those tools, can help to paint a picture and are useful.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions that came through in the chat. Someone is working on kelp forest management, and they were curious if this was something that would be included in the FishSCORE project.
I think that's a great question. We, so far to date, have been more focused on sort of wild harvest fisheries, but certainly there is interaction in terms of particularly diversification opportunities, interactions with aquaculture, and certainly kelp aquaculture may be done for harvest and food production, but also for some climate benefits as well. And so I would absolutely say we would welcome learning more and incorporating, projects and fisheries that are aquaculture, that are in the aquaculture realm. It has not been sort of a focus of the work that has been leading into FishSCORE to date, but we are very open and hope to broaden those conversations and would welcome, your participation in the network and an opportunity to expand that dialogue.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, that we're looking at how different communities, different kinds of communities, both are what marine foods are for them. So that may not be fish, that may be wild kelp, forest management, and not sure exactly the kind of work you're working on, but I know that like in Maine, that's a big part of some of the things that impacts communities here as well. So understanding how different communities are impacted by climate change and how that is affecting any kinds of species that they're working on harvesting, and how the different opportunities for expanding or differing how their harvest strategies have been over time, based on what climate is and how climate is impacting those harvest strategies.
Great. Would you be interested to learn about projects from other countries that are developing risk assessment processes, but they may not have been applied yet?
Absolutely. I think we're all shaking our heads yes. And so, yes, I think we are very interested in learning about approaches that others are taking or are thinking about taking. Like I said, we come to this with some tools that we have worked with, but I think a huge advantage of the Ocean Decade Network and the Ocean Decade program and the network that we are creating through FishSCORE is the opportunity to bring together perspectives and approaches and to learn across systems around the world. And we'd be very eager to learn from many of you who might be doing related things in different ways in very different systems.
And if there's a possibility that you're already attending the World Fisheries Congress, and we would welcome that kind of engagement and conversations around those things at the workshop that we're having on the day before too.
Fantastic. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and I think that's a really good note to end on. So thanks everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to our speakers. We'll be sending the recording around for this webinar in the next week or two, as well as the resources that were mentioned in the presentation. So thanks again for joining, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you. Bye.